Europe is much more advanced or ahead in this space compared to the United States. And already we see a lot of pushback that Silicon Valley companies are saying that this is going to stifle innovation, which is the national resource technology are currently there. The federal government might start enforcing some laws. Different states are talking about different kinds of legislation. Like California is talking about some data privacy. So we might see some difference in how states will enforce. So it may also mean that we see a sort of a patchwork, and that's not a very ideal situation for us as a nation. But we may just end up seeing different pieces. And of course, people can always take their server somewhere else. But I think that that's not that straightforward, because if you're a company operating in certain states, you might have to comply with those states.
This is kind of a posture, but there's also been a couple of proposals from different quarters to create a new agency, something like the International Energy Commission, or the FDA, which makes a certain kind of sense. But then if you look at how they have worked, how they operate, it's been much more like you were describing at the end, a kind of public posture that allows them to claim accountability. Well, in actuality, there's not much. And then the second part of the equation I ran into last week at a forum at Carnegie Mellon, several people there said, well, you know, everybody's talking about we need to train our own systems, we need to develop our own AI. But the kind of data that Google and Microsoft and X and Facebook can draw makes it a very uncompetitive situation for startups and small companies. So that's a very difficult problem to solve and a difficult situation to address using policy.
What about the other perspective that if you look at the greater good, the more data we have, the better the system. Why can't the government use that argument? Let's say, for example, for medical records. If they have more records, right? We see that we get away. Why can't the government use that and open up in everybody's record? Then the system will better job for what the other argument is.
Well, I think in Europe, I'm seeing some of the sort of a publicly funded efforts to build large language models. I'm not sure. I think that's Bloom. It's called the name escapes me, right? But that's like the only public, very large scale effort that I've seen. To do that in the United States, we would need something like what happened in the Cold War. Like, you know, we put a sorry, but that is what it was like. It was called in those days. So it would require huge sustained effort and would require some bipartisan cooperation. I'm not sure how feasible it is for the government to compete with all its billions of dollars, or Google with their deep mind and all the other BARD and other systems. There's just, I think this is one place where industry is way ahead of academia. All the bright minds have already flocked to Silicon Valley and all the startups. And so I'm really, that policy makes a lot of sense, but I think that battle is already lost from it.
So just to amplify that a little bit, my simple answer would be, I don't think there's anything wrong with that concept, but bringing it to fruition transparently and so that it can't be manipulated by governmental or behemoths is a major undertaking. And so it's the same with all the data scraping. There's really nothing inherently wrong with scraping data. There's just an article today at Times about surgery and being able to get instantaneous feedback via AI in ways that helps make it possible to do various kinds of operations much better, much more effectively, and so forth. But when people see the pharmaceutical companies start manipulating that for profit, it's a different story. So to me, the main difficulty with the idea is how you bring it into fruition so that it actually works for the public good. And so far, government and business don't have a great but have you?
Yeah, so I had a question along the lines of, about the laws, but more about timing. So like, there's only recently been a law, funding to help get the law. And so, with the internet, people things that have already been academics. And so, is it even possible to try to have effective laws that would be useful for the future? Or are we only legislating retroactively?
That's a good question. I think that's kind of getting at the crux of what you were saying too. Like, what can we do right now? I think that there are some things that we could do that have precedent in other segments under categories like consumer protection. So let me give you a couple of thoughts. So when we're talking about what data is in the training set and where that came from, that's one point of transparency. All of that actually has a pretty well understood set of metrics, both from machine learning science, information science, and also on the textual side, corpus linguistics, where we can ask companies to report on the quality of the training set. When we published about training a model way back in 2019, you can never get something published without disclosing your methods. How did you build your corpus? How did you? I'm looking at corpus with case here. So these are known methods that these companies have so far not been compelled to disclose. But with something like a nutrition facts label, we can do that, right? So we could ask them to, we want to be able to flip over the result and see what's in it. And I don't think that's a heavy lift right now. They could produce that information. There may be some reasons competitively why they don't want it. And so there would be some wrangling there. But that would be a target, I think, for some legislation now, is some disclosure about what's happening with the training set and the quality of the work. Yeah, we could talk about where else in the processing pipeline that it would be appropriate for disclosure and where it would be appropriate to be proprietary.
Yeah, I think the idea we just talked about in the AI communities, model cards. So model cards gives you, there's a lot of papers on it, you can always look at it, send your references if you want. The idea is a little bit like, if you, a little bit like software engineering, that you do the systems testing and find the bugs. And that you're supposed to test it at different levels. Someone who worked in long-time IT, which is very unfortunate. But IT used to be subject to a lot of testing. And why isn't that not at least us, these companies, to disclose? It's one question is the training data as well, but it's also something like a product liability. If you're using software, any product, just and it's making a decision that affects people's lives, denies them credit, or doesn't makes prioritizes healthcare, then we have to. Well, in like 99% of the cases. So So the model cards, this kind of nutrition labels, there's a whole set of ideas from product liability, from consumer safety, from regulation. And it's not as if people haven't done it in movie safety. Have the national, what is that, Transportation Safety Board. So I think the same practices or same principles can be applied. Maybe retrospective, but we can do it.
Two of the disc panels are related to a couple of spots in the pipeline that I think correspond to what you're saying. So one is called content provenance, and that's the ability to take a result and to have a credible way to walk back and see how that result was created in terms of what the information, where it came from. And we are seeing, like with Adobe's announcement, some attention to that as even a market, potentially even a marketing issue. The other is governance. And I think here governance would mean not only about who participates and how they're making some decisions, but I think it would be something like what we would think about as methods in the processing pipeline. I'll just talk about LLMs here. I'm far less familiar with the image processing pipeline, but I can, from the work that we have done training models, there are at least two other spots where it's really important to be transparent because the decisions you make in those places affect the outcome dramatically. So the next one down the line after you assemble the corpus is your text processing of that corpus. You take bounded sets of text, like all the novels written in English, and you turn it into a smaller unit and you homogenize that unit. And you can do a number of steps in order to make those units homogeneous. They're roughly words most of the time, but not all the time are they whole words, and what we would recognize as a word. They eventually become something called tokens. And to make a word into a token, you have to do something to it. And what you have to do to it depends on what language it comes from. So in English, we chop endings off a lot of times, or we normalize things like tense. In other languages, we might not do the same thing. In German, for example, we inflect words much more than we do in English to make them mean stuff. So we might actually split words and make two tokens out of it in German in a way that we wouldn't do it in English. So that's just the next down the line. So tell us give us some clue about how your model relies on your text processing steps in order to produce the result, and make us sure that you're not amplifying bias when you do that.
And actually, I make things worse. A couple of weeks ago, Brendan, I think you introduced a discussion at STEM building, the concept of the black box. And teaching and learning, but last weekend we also went into that. And at one point, so this goes back to your comment about accountability. And there's a real theoretical difficulty there, which is how do you create an account for a black box, which inherently you don't know. And I raised this in relation to transparency too, and somebody in the audience said, yeah, it's not just a black box, it's 30 billion black boxes. And so it's one thing to talk about disclosing what you know, but if you're working with systems which you either don't know the outcomes of, or you hide some because you don't think your competitors will, or you don't want the public to know, it gets even worse in terms of transparency.
So I just wanted to add to Bill's point about large language models. So I teach some of these things in my class, natural language processing, and to teach a little bit about sort of the road to ChatGPT, if you will. We take all these, large language models, essentially reduce language to a bunch of tokens. And what they're trying to do is kind of predicting sequence. So very long time ago, we were talking about word inheritance, which is already quaint compared to the current generation of large language models. But that's about predicting the quick brown fox jumped over something fox or something like that. So it's the predicting the next word. And that with all the attention and large mechanisms that we have, the attention-based learning. And so what we have now is essentially something that takes millions of words and spits out some other prediction. And I think there's like some very insightful papers, and I actually was looking at my phone to make sure I have the correct reference. Arvind Narayan and Princeton. They've done some fantastic work exposing some of the weaknesses of large language models. Because at the core, it's not just hallucination, which is a problem because it's just predicting sequence. But it's fundamentally a large language model doesn't understand context. It's just predicting a bunch of things. And I think that's where our, as people, we should be careful deploying this very large scale machinery into things which are context dependent and things where you require judgment, intuition, and reasoning. It doesn't mean that large language models are not useful. It could be very, very useful because discovering candidate molecules for vaccine development, mRNA, something like that. But I think the kind of hype we are seeing about generative AI outpaces some of these things that should give us pause, the risks of using without any guardrails. So I come back to what I said about 6 months ago.
I think it also touches on rethink how we think about creation, creative activity, and production. I just read a thing yesterday where a judge made a ruling saying that you couldn't copyright anything generated by AI because there's no creation involved. And all the creation is being done by the platform, which I understand why he would say that, particularly if you think about historical production of art. It's been, but when you're generating things with AI, you're generating hundreds of candidates related to these tokens or words. And it's not very hard. He talks about it be more productive. You can generate 200 images, yeah, right. Where do you start at it? And you spend 20 times as much time selecting it as you used to because you have hundreds of tiny permutations that aren't really significant. And you're like, well, which one of these variations really is striking? And that takes tons of time. It actually just changes the mode of productivity from generating material to reviewing, and Bill has talked extensively about revising writing. It's the same with images. The revision process explodes. And so if from that point of view, the creativity comes in, how do you generate prompts that don't produce insignificant variation? And then how do you evaluate the rhetoric of the prompt in relation to this huge corpus of image, which you might only choose 2 or 3 of them. So there, I think there is a connection between the creative domain and other aspects of this methodology.
Yeah, I'm reminded, Mark, you probably know this better than I do, that there were similar arguments about the history of photography, about whether or not a photograph was a human.
It's going to end painting.
Yeah, it's going to destroy painting or drawing. Yeah, I wanted to just take a note. This is useful in this kind of language about accountability. I think we have 2 words, 2 concepts maybe that we didn't have 6 months ago. One is this notion of what to call it when the LLM makes up something, a hallucination. So we've all decided we're going to call it that. This is cool. And that's really, it captures 2 things I think are important. One is that it's convincing, but it's not real. And so we all have that now. So use that word, and I think that's useful. The other one is, as you were saying about where is the reasoning or where's the training that is keeping it from doing something even worse. We have some language to talk about the LLM as the kernel. And then what we're starting to call the place where the LLM lives and what you interact with is the wrapper. So these large language models don't work on their own. You encounter them in the context of another application, but that wrapper might have several layers. And it's the training in those layers that might make the difference between how the language model performs in the task that you're giving it versus in another context where it's different. Where there's already talk in the market, so this is my question for you, is if you're a startup right now, the model, training the model costs so much that people are like, I'm leaving the model alone, I'm gonna compete on the wrapper. Is that what you're hearing from the business side?
Exactly. So, it's, in one sense, I think the amount of entrepreneurial activity that is happening in the high-tech space, I've not seen this since the dot-com and most, I don't know, so there are some younger people that are familiar with it. This is dot-com era or even bigger in terms of, and all the new product ideas that I'm seeing, or the kind of entrepreneurship that's happening is you use these APIs to ChatGPT and other, and primarily I think ChatGPT. It's like the sort of a base layer, and everyone's trying to use it. And I think that creates two issues. One is large language models and generative AI is very energy intensive. Costs, and we've not looked at all those other issues. What is going into training these models for the open AIs in the world? We've not looked at the environmental footprint. Second, so of course it's like this monopolistic setup where somebody owns all this intellectual power, if you will. And sort of a standardization. And I think there's Darren Ashmore, economist at MIT, who warns about this. It's like a social automation, talks about. It's like a very sad situation where everybody can automate some things, and we are stuck in a very negative equilibrium, sort of not a very, it's not something where everyone's creative potential is being utilized. Automate some things, so let's just automate it. And so I think we have to also, societal level, we have to worry about this.
There's also a strange experiential side of that. It's a short story, but I published an image on Facebook a couple of weeks ago. It was actually a Japanese guy. And in my description that I do photography, experimental photography, and AI generative images, so that people don't spend a lot of time in hearing what's what. Well, I got a comment from a person that said, this was such a beautiful image, and I was just really moved by it. And then all of a sudden I realized I was being cheated. And I almost sent you an email telling you what a fraud you are and how horrible it is for you to have this experience with me. And so my response to the comment was, well, I hate to disappoint you, and I know this is complicated, so I'm not making fun. That's actually a photograph. It's not an AI generative image. And then, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for going off and flip it out. And I was like, this is the social dynamics of publishing now, because I get people who are like, Mark, is this real? And I made a joke with Bill CoLab, asking him if he was real or AI. And I get that every single day, at least for certain work. So that, I think, is a change in social reality. People weren't necessarily, actually photographs have been used fraudulently since the turn of the century. I took a photography class and they talked about photoshopping out generals who were fell from Stalin's favor and stuff like that. So it's not, visual fraud is not a new thing, but there is something fascinating about the degree and the pervasiveness of it that I think is worth thinking about.
I think I just wanted to say that, a lot of estimates are, and maybe it's already happening, on platforms like Instagram, TikTok, the AI generated content is just like flooding. Between human versus AI anymore. And I think especially like if you like cat videos on Instagram or TikTok, I'm pretty sure some of them, it's very clear like some are, it doesn't look manipulated and it's manipulated. So maybe the Soviets used to Photoshop the generals who were next to Stalin, but that was a very sophisticated operation and only Stalin could control who gets Photoshop. But now we get all together. And there's just like what is the truth? Where are objective facts? I think we're seeing some of this unfortunately with a lot of old fake content flooding, like X used to be Twitter, events now what's happening in Instagram. So,
Yeah, my earlier account of what account meant kind of traced upstream from the prompt, right? The idea that we ought to be able to see before we prompt or as we prompt what's going into producing our results. That's the nutrition facts. I think there's an analog to what happens downstream. And that should be something like a chain of custody, where if you are consuming an image or some you see a thing, especially if it's from an outlet that is trying to win your credibility. I think that we might come to expect some disclosure of the chain of custody that produced the object that we're looking at. And so there's a chance that there will be some pressure, not just regulatory pressure, I think that will be some ethical pressure, some market pressure for the tools that we use to be able to produce that as well. So that you can flip it over and see whence did this come?
Yeah, and I think that has to be accessible. And nobody's going to, accredited script that takes 30 hours to look at, or 3 billion views. But there has to be some way to do it sensibly. But another aspect of this that came up in the discussion about kind of fascinating. Satan's homogenization. Everybody that I know, all the creative artists, have acknowledged that there's a tendency towards cliche and general, and sort of sometimes that is, and so people who do this start developing. So one of the interesting points in this discussion, several people said, well, the real point of working with these platforms is to see if we can generate something unique and something extraordinary. And that's the first time I've heard that from the community of artists as a whole. So,
the thing with nutrition is impact includes and the obesity problem. So we can have regulatory bodies and rules and legislation that force the things and companies to take certain action. But that doesn't really change the consumer behavior. And we're at a little bit of an inflection point where the consumer base is already used to it, but now we're how to behave in this thing. But I think part of the problem with the nutrition labels or the food pyramid is that they were wrongly conceived, and the assumption was that it would change consumer behavior.
that's a great point.
Yeah.
And I actually agree at some level, but I think that stream, like what Bill was talking about, upstream and downstream, I feel, it's more like a content production supply chain or something like that. That would, there's some transparency. The transparency may not change anything, but it's probably better than thinking that there was probably a time when book was marketed as for
Yeah, I would say that's the way in which accountability is a floor and not a ceiling. Right now, we have no ability to produce an account that's credible at all, and if we create one, it still won't mean that folks are going to not put stuff out in the market that's essentially junk food. I think that we'll still see this.
It's actually probably one of the questions, but another issue I'd like to introduce, a lot of the discussion that's occurring about makes it sound as if AI is the problem. And what we're talking about is structuring their relationship to AI that's making it problematic. In some ways, that's an even harder problem than whatever problems banks is. So I just want to throw that out, but we can come back to it, but you would actually have.
Well, unbelievable. You know, we have to be careful that we're not really wrong thing. Because we put sugar in all our food, which is why we see our labels. So we can label what are we missing, what should we really be. And this the AI itself.
I think that's part of the question, right?
So it's just saying, and normal we should hear the idea. This AI is fortunate. It's just, I think point that we focus on this single part. You cannot just take off the whole thing on the daily basis. It is a helping tool, it's something to do.
Practical, if you're looking back at the Supreme Court for this for a second, if somebody owns a copyright and finds out that it's been used without their permission in the training set, is there any practical way for the system to remove that data?
I think that's the question that only legislation and legislative efforts can answer. Right now, that's the discussion I brought up about the Hugging Face, which is kind of an open platform, but there was a controversy today about they were using some training data set, it's great without consent. The person who published the book kind of made the. So, do we have a register? Need legislative action.
But I mean, for the computer program itself, is there some way you can go in and get a feed here that file system?
You have to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
So it's not effective. It's not effective. Even if it did, it wouldn't necessarily set the scale that we're talking.
You have to remember it's not analyzing the patterns, and there is nothing there. And like this gets into a really interesting social discussion too. You know, street photographers don't create street. And every photographer who photographs thinks that doesn't credit those. And there are all kinds of things in the images that go in. So like the idea that analyzing relationships and things that are made is somehow unethical is something I think we need to think through whether that's really the case or not.
I think sorry to interject, but the method of assigning copyright essentially ignores that there's a lot of inputs to the process, the creative process. It ignores so many of the Disney stories, for example, they were all retellings of something that brothers and little brothers themselves must have got it from some other source. So there's sort of a whole composite things that go into creative process, but the way copyright law works is assigning like a copyright to someone who's a creator, and that is it's very skewed, the generative AI, because what you just have is just a lot of patterns. It's not deliberately copying a person's style. So I could just go and put a prompt like write me this in style of J.K. Rowling. What does that mean? I can sit and write a parody of J.K. Rowling, which is perfectly legal for me to do.
Yeah, this is something we talked a little bit about last time, but I think it's so hard to wrap our head around. And it's the T in GPT stands for transformer. And what that means is it takes all those tokens of words and it turns them into something else. To the graph. That's what it's using all of the patterns to transform. By the time it does that, you can't trace back the math into individual words anymore in a way that we would think about, let's say, attributing something that Mark wrote in a text, like as a direct quote or as a phrase. Any sufficiently short engram of tokens is going to be iterated millions of times. So it's just it's not the same sort of thing where you can give credit to one person.
It's also, in some ways, so I've worked for years with a method called synthesis, and you generate thousands of frequencies per second. And you can change the rate, and you can change the bandwidth. But somebody would ask, well, why don't you write the notes? And it's like, in the first place, there's a lot of frequencies in one note. They increase as you go out in acoustic space. But to write 10 seconds of sound with that number of notes would take about 3 years. And so there are methods that are used, which essentially use random generation and filters long before you sit in the fan. And if you want, you can get, 3 blind mice come out, depending on how you structure the filter. If you filter out everything except the 3 blind mice, you get 3 blind mice. And so a lot of these techniques are also working with this kind of stochastic approach, and they're landing on some stuff like collages in the turn of the century or later.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that this is the transformer architecture is trained on billions of parameters. So if you can visualize 100 or it sort of mind boggles, I think. And I think that's the important thing to emphasize about generative.
We have a paper under review right now that uses this same idea with output from an LLM. And it builds on a project that we worked on several years ago now called the hedge-o-matic, where we were trying to isolate a particular signal in scientific writing called a hedge. That's when you shift the strength of your claim to match the strength of your evidence. And it's a really important thing to do if you're communicating scientifically. So we describe in that paper a method for essentially doing a revision to an initial draft to boost or cut, like EQ the hedge signal. And the input from the user would just be like a knob, like more or less. And using the same analysis chain, the same classifier that we use to find the hedge signals, we can manipulate those signals. And I think that those are going to be something like that is going to be an environment like Mark and I would use for editing audio would be something called a digital audio workstation where we have these presets and we have filters and plugins to process signals. And all of a sudden you're not working with individual notes anymore, you're working with textures and sounds and I can emulate this amp and this microphone in this room in 1967 if I want, if I have all of the plugins. We're gonna have something like that.
Actually, Google has a audio LLM that allows you to, if you put in a prompt like 10 5-foot panes of glass falling down the stair breaking, it will generate a sound of that from your text. And it's still in a research stage, but some of the results are, you can look it up on the internet. It's pretty amazing.
OpenAI now has a lower generation of image recognition, image plus the language model. So it's already a bit disconcerting, or it's already in 6 months, the frontiers already shifted. And so I think one thing I would say as a researcher is that large language models have to be a very powerful tool, properly used. I'm sure there's a lot of discovery, combinatorial. What should concern us is not large language models per se, but the fact that you have a lot of non-transparent use or ownership of not just the data, but also the resources by essentially just one or two monopolistic corporations. And if you see this Google trial antitrust thing that's going on, Microsoft is playing the victim, which is kind of like really interesting. So Microsoft versus Google, so sort of boggles the mind, like who's the victim, not sure.
I just want to say, we'll get to the next one, but we are at the point, if you didn't notice, where if there are questions that you wish we could respond to or that you'd like to raise, if we have a chance to do that, please do so. This is kind of a part, and we gladly respond to things, especially things that you think you wish we talked about and haven't really touched on, or we haven't touched on enough. But I know you've been waiting a while, so. Yeah.
So, one thing that has been sticking in my mind since you kind of referred to the dot-com, that works, that was it. Is something similar going to happen with AI? Is it going to be accountability that's on the bus? Like, where do you see the landscape of this?
Well, it's hard to predict the future, but at least if we go by that problem was more to do with user expectations and industry. Would industry folks in industry are they really buying some of the things that the government hides that they don't, which is some of the ideas that the government were introduced, I would say at that time. 20 years later, it's actually more broadly used. So solutions to all things like hallucinations, or I think there was a case of a judge or a lawyer used ChatGPT to prepare some testimony and just made up facts. And so we can't use this stuff without any oversight. So I think now the questions that should concern us is regulatory issues, or I think that's kind of my be the pushback.
And that example from assistant overseer to overseer or something like that.
We take the that.
It's an accurate problem. A question that we often get asked is, we're going around talking about this, is what are you worried about? So I'll give you, since it's October and it's time for scary stuff. One is that LLMs are as transparent to us in our use of them as they're ever going to get today. And from here forward, it will become less and less obvious whether there's an LLM involved. That's because market-wise, financial-wise, everybody's incentivized to be in demo mode. Look at this thing, like it's a toy, look what it can do. There's a future around the corner where it will be in there and you won't know it's in there necessarily. And sometimes that might be just fine with you, and that's actually where a lot of the legacy AI technologies are today. So if you have one of those cars that nudges you back onto the road, It learned all that stuff from hours and hours of machine learning. And you might not even be aware that its auto assist is an AI inside your car, right? LLMs are going to be like that, and they could be like that already. So where do you get to the scary part? So think about a large government that also runs its own social network and has an interest in controlling speech. A few that might qualify. I don't know why they wouldn't be
It's
using an
already,
LLM there.
it's already happening in China.
Yeah, way well.
And some of the, I think the uses of AI in China, are the way the generative AI methods are trained is, it's like history is almost like written according to what's the official doctrine. So we already have, we've seen that in some companies.
It also gets some parallels with genetic engineering. And we have a coding exhibit which is titled Food Fight, from London. And she's working with CRISPR and working with CRISPR on hickory. And part of the point of the exhibit, which I haven't had a chance to see once we open up, is that CRISPR can have some positive beneficial advantages for people and communities. Like they're working with a community where being able to grow chicory would be very beneficial to their local economy. But the kind of CRISPR that's available won't grow there. But so they've genetically engineered a version that will. So her whole point is this is dystopian and utopian, and we determine what the outcome is going to be. And that seems to be something that pops up with all of this over and over. It's like, again, it's not the AI, it's are we going to do it? And when talking about what we afraid of, I was like, well, what if the AI starts recommending really desirable things for the common good? What if it says nobody should not have health care? Are people going to go along with that? Or are they going to revolt and say, hey, this thing is proposing preposterous things that are going to interfere with profits? We got to shut it down. And that goes back to like Robert's too, and there's a question with that, which is like, how do you shut a black box down?
Yeah, that's a good question. Another one that has me thinking, I'm curious what my colleagues think about this. Who's also on the circuit is talking about this stuff. So there's a bunch of us in the room who take different angles. But one that worries me, I'm going to make an analogy with climate change, right? So we've done some calculations to determine that if we see a certain amount of sea level rise, that we know that there will be whole regions like the Maldives and the Marshall Islands that will go under. I think we face a similar crisis when we talk about island ecosystems of linguistic diversity that don't show up in the results of what these language models produce routinely. That in a very short amount of time, with just a little, it wouldn't even take official regulation or official sanction. It would just take repeated use. We would see the ocean rise enough that those linguistic islands would vanish underneath. And the example that I try to give is, under what conditions do you have to prompt ChatGPT right now to say the word y'all? What's preventing y'all from just disappearing in 10 years?
Yeah, I think this is the two questions again, going back to this kind of standardization, when we all depend on like ChatGPT. Some of this like sort of global pop music, if you will, a lot of to me. It's just me. And it's because maybe we're only listening to like all the stuff. There's like a homogenization of the. That might happen with popular culture. It may happen for example, to as a substitute for a human peer review. Then is there a problem because the LLM doesn't really, it's not so trained in the ways that are kind of underrepresented, studied areas, historically underrepresented communities examine certain questions, things like that. That's a danger at a society level that we are only focusing on kind of like power law.
Yeah.
We should worry about that.
Yeah, and speed is what worries me about it, because in the past, we've seen similar kinds of literacy technologies that have a homogenizing effect on language. But in the past, we've also had people and, rulemaking or standard setting to kind of point to and agitate about. Here, there's no one human agent necessarily responsible for establishing where that line is, where the standard is, and it can happen so quickly. Yeah.
So you keep me talking into the concern about homogenization. But in the social media universe that we just lived through over the last 10 years, in which many of the bad actors were actually fragmenting reality, right? Like, criticism of foreign policy is that they're not really so concerned what the outcome is, as long as it's highly fragmented, because that serves the ratings. Right? So like the invention of Brexit, the invention of QAnon, the alternate realities that are not based on any really actual shared reality. So we're not homogenizing around 100 people. We're creating multiple highly contentious frames.
See, I would say that when we talk about homogenization, QAnon or like Brexit, it's also homogenization within that community. In other words, maybe there are a lot of people who believe a lot of alternate realities, but social media and now so much generative AI making it very easy to create content, create memes, propagate stuff. I think this is where you kind of, if you want to take like the top 10 conspiracy theories, what's the distribution of those top 10? Like, how did people believe that? So, what now is possible is that the fringe, like people who believe the earth is flat, they can go into YouTube and find each other. Right? So, there's like flat earth. So, I think that's the homogenization we are talking about. That elements can standardize around various elements, right? Which theories or conspiracies or and I also study this information in the area of healthcare, and this is very, very apparent when we look at things like vaccine. So I think that's where I would draw the distinction between what is a dominant paradigm and a fringe but dominant within that fringe group. I think the world we live in with all this genetic content and generative AI, generating all kinds of content.
I thought you were going to perspective it differently when you first started, which is because I do have some hope there. I think there are ways to combat that sea level rise. And one of them is, I think, from what we can see, the way that humans stabilize written conventions for being understood is somewhat homeostatic, meaning we stabilize around things that are adaptive. And this is a new kind of source of stress in the ecosystem, is to have massive amounts of the same crap demand. So we will adapt to that too. I don't know exactly how, but an example you were talking about social media is, so already on TikTok we actually see a pretty you can see an interesting alternative discourse forming around ways to express things that TikTok won't let you say. And it's a combination of the use of visual emoji and then the words for those things. So you can say the word peach and it doesn't mean the fruit. And you can write it out, right? And so now on TikTok, if I say peach, I don't mean the thing that you are picked from a tree. And people are using that and it's leaking over into other media, which is kind of fascinating. But that's an example of how people are adapting a new kind of genre standard because they're moving around this restriction on that platform. I think that we will see a lot of that.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm wondering if anybody who hasn't had a chance to say something, wants to say something, make a comment, or ask a question, or raise the issue to it. Yes?
I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. So many long, so many, and they go so many different areas. It's that and then Google Reads. I've been tempted to just say that, yes, for AI, government, PowerPoints on it, and, but I'm wondering about people in the future, and they're like, there's just so much and so much attention. Maybe they want to just have something that's basic, universal in some way. And they want to just say, okay, let's just all agree on that. So we can just move on, some rush. And I just kind of wonder about the future. How that might go. Fascinating.
So this is actually a little bit of something what I study with the maybe 30 years ago, 50 years ago. Or you could go and explore someone like Java, New England Journal of Medicine. But now what do? We go to TikTok, where there can be paid promotion. There's TikTok like influencers, there's people on Instagram, you can push advice. So one question that I used to ask in my research I look at is what are the criteria that the digital platforms are using to even validate and establish that these are credible sources of information? Because what now Instagram or YouTube or TikTok, they are de facto credentialing authority, right? They are not like your healthcare providers, like you're depending on them. So, to your point, I think it's like we've given a lot of control of our life to digital platforms because that's kind of nice. Like we are going and finding stuff online. Look as authoritative sources. And it's very comforting. But it also comes with its own this anxiety. We don't know which source to trust. We don't know. Yeah, as someone like me, so I think these are the questions. So I don't know if I answered your question. I think I'm posing more questions.
So I might make some more questions too. The event I referred to is actually within the framework of transgenerational dialogues. So I got paired with a 22-year-old from China, and we had several dialogues leading up to this conference. And it turns out that she went into design because she didn't want to be a photographer. She'd been doing photography since she was 12 years old. So our initial conversation was the difference between my history as a photographer coming from the 60s and developing my film and so forth, and hers. And amazingly enough, by the end of it, she was like, oh my gosh, I understand you so well. I must have an old person inside of me. It's just crestfallen. But fortunately for me, a few days later, she was like, can I see some of your work? So I showed her some of the stuff I've been doing in the picture. She was like, you did that? That's asked them, I just didn't think professors did stuff like that. I can't believe you do this every day. You make images. And so we had this discussion and found this point of connection because I was involved with it. And it reminded me, like a few months ago, one of my composition students said, well, I didn't get anything done this week. I just made a few videos for TikTok. And I was like, can I see them? Did you make anything? She said, yeah, I made like 70 of them. I was like, I want to see 70 of the choice for this. She said, why here? And so she couldn't believe that one of her music professors wanted to hear something made for TikTok. So I think part of the answer I would give is we need to engage with these things and show that they can get out of the niche. They can get out of the commonplace in engineering and produce something. Because honestly, so far, everything I've tried, I find some potential here that's worth exploring. And so I think it's a matter of, we need to learn some stuff too. We need older generations or the faculty. It's not just students and like, kind of humoring them. You gotta get that brass tacks and then the traditional ways. Those traditional things come out too, like I told this. Everything I learned as a photographer in the last 40 years comes in handy. Say, knowing composition, knowing light, knowing all kinds of stuff. It's nothing is ever wasted. I can still take photographs. It didn't go away. I still can take a camera and shoot.
Yeah, I think I take some hope from that too, like the evolution of writing tools into digital audio workstations is, in some ways it's kind of terrifying because it means that we will see there'll be a lot of preset stuff that you can just load in and use, and everybody will just use the same beat, same chord progression, hear the same song over and over and over again. At the same time, what that does is the fear that we have that we'll replace human creativity with that, I think, is unfounded, because if you've ever sat in front of a DAW with all those tools and still tried to write a good song, you can't. It's still very hard. You may have all of this music at your fingertips, but if you don't have a good idea, the song's going to be terrible.
And I think going back to Jerry's point about all the nutrition labels, maybe nutrition labels, but it still serves some society purpose. And I think that's like also important thing. Shit. Others, we should at least persist in quest to make systems more transparent, even if they may not change some outcomes, but somehow, we can still hope for some better tomorrow.
I don't think that they speak to the need to both regulate the industry and private. And I think that we can't let the focus just be on any other things. We have a broader conversation about a much harder problem, which is how do we train in society to use this effectively and creatively and help.
I think algorithm is interesting.
Yeah, I think, and I would push back just a little bit. I think you're right that those nutrition labels don't do much at all for controlling consumer behavior, but they do normalize producer behavior in a helpful way. So I manage risk factors related to type 2 diabetes, and one of the things that's useful to me is being able to look at a label and see carbohydrates. And so what that has done over time is not only can we see how many are in there, but it also has incentivized the market to produce things that factor neatly into 15 gram units. I don't know if anybody else is part of the same diabetes, but that's how we count it. And 1 unit is 15 grams. And so now, not only do we see that being transparent, but Oreos come in packages of 30 grams, so they're 2 units. And it does have this kind of effect where if you're willing to sort of work in that structure, you can regulate things a little bit, all the way down to the consumer level.
And some experiences can actually transform your relationship with those labels. I knew them for 40 years, had a heart attack, and all of a sudden my entire program for reconstructing a diet required that I read. So I started paying inordinate attention to them. I was like, how did I ignore these for all these years?
Who knew that a Hot Pocket had 1,500 grams of sodium?
So, and at the time, it's just go. Kristen?
Oh, I was just gonna ask if you had looked into any like jamming software like Glaze that disrupts AI artwork.
jamming software, but one of my projects, current research projects is about deliberately skewing content, trying to see like how people, and I think there's some sort of this confluency of the divergence between like visual images and the sort of textual rhetoric. I think those are all very interesting questions. But I should also say, from what I've also seen of the literature, the new studies, AI is very good at doing this stuff.
So there's a group in Rochester, I can't remember the name of the group, but it's led by a person named Eric Saladriou. They just went to their hackers conferences and trying to mess everything up to educate people to the values of jamming. And he has a blog that he publishes every other week about sort of he doesn't use the term jam, but it's sort of like going against the grain of AI in lots of different ways and going ChatGPT and so on. But I also want to mention that we do have another event coming up, which is an event we're co-sponsoring with Rhetoric and Culture, which is, you can find it on MSU Museum for the date, and it's going to be focusing on different aspects of ChatGPT. You might think it looks like how to use ChatGPT in your profession, and there's some of that, but it's actually trying to look critically at this tool and envision ways in which you might contribute something to your profession and become an important tool, and also how you can develop factors, right? This tool in your domain. And then we also have